Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Judi Miller. Judi Miller is a coach, speaker, and author of her first book, Perfect, A Path to Love, Forgiveness, and Transformation. And you can find out more about Judi Miller and her work at judimiller.net. Welcome, Judi Miller.
Oh, it's great to be here, Catherine. Thank you so much.
So, Judi Miller, you have a background in finance. Can you share with our audience how did somebody with a background in finance come to write a book about forgiveness?
That's a great story. So, like many people, I felt different as a child. I was actually born in Trinidad, which is an island in the Caribbean, and then I moved to the U.S. when I was very young. But I always felt different. I felt like I didn't belong. I was also actually born with 11 fingers, and I could sense and feel different energies, especially at night. So many of the emotions and fears that I felt throughout my life was feeling different, feeling incomplete, feeling unworthy. And the reason I say that is because when I look out into the world, I see so many other people who actually share these same feelings and sentiments. So I started my career as a CPA, as you mentioned, and I went to work in the healthcare industry in finance. And I felt that I had to prove myself over and over again. But no matter what I did, I still felt unworthy. And in this journey that I'll describe to you, I learned how to let go of the stories that no longer served me. And my wish is really to share that with you and your listeners.
All right. So, can you sort of give us a high level summary of your book, Perfect?
Sure, I'd love to. So, like many children, I had fears as a child. I was actually afraid of drowning, but I was also terrified of the night. So, as I mentioned before, I could sense and feel different spirits and energies, but I was also afraid of being sexually assaulted. I had never been assaulted. So, as you could imagine, these feelings and these fears were extremely confusing as a child. So I literally would crawl into bed every night, pull the covers over my head, and recite the Lord's Prayer over and over again until exhausted, I would fall asleep. And this continued well into my 20s. So, as we mentioned, I started my career as a CPA, very traditional lifestyle, very traditional career. But then I would come home terrified of what I couldn't explain. And then I met my husband at work. We got married and had two incredible children. And in the exhaustion of raising two children, commuting 3 hours a day for work, working 40 to 50 hours a week, in that exhaustion, Catherine, everything stopped. The fear, the terror, the subtle energies, the subtle whispers all stopped. But then my kids grew up and went off to college, and the house became silent. And many of your listeners who are empty nesters may know what that silence feels like. But in the silence, everything returned. The terror, the pain. It literally felt like someone was always standing behind me, or if there were eyes staring at me from across the room. And my neighbors must have thought I was comical because I would literally like tiptoe around my house, afraid of what I might encounter. I would wake up at night terrified, clutching at my husband in fear, and soon we both began to lose sleep. Around the same time, I started to bleed uncontrollably month after month, and a good friend of mine recommended that I see a doctor, and my doctor recommended that I have a hysterectomy. And Catherine, as I mentioned, I worked in the healthcare industry for over 20 years, and I do trust modern medicine, but I was terrified of this surgery, and it felt like the same pain and terror that I had as a child, and the same pain and terror that returned as an adult. So a friend of mine recommended that I read a book called Light Emerging by Barbara Brennan. Barbara was a former NASA physicist, and she actually studied the human energy field. And what she learned, she was actually able to heal people. So, literally, days before my surgery, I found myself Googling healers near me. As I sat across from my healer for that very first time, I literally, and I'm very, very auditory, literally heard the click of a lock like my entire life was finally locking into place. And at the time, I didn't know the role that that healer would actually play in my family's history. So my healer helped me heal after the hysterectomy. And then we started to explore in the following months this unexplainable fear of the darkness and of the night. And I never shared with her the fear of sexual assault, right? So we started looking at my childhood. Was there anything from my childhood that elicited this fear, but nothing came to light? Then we started talking about my parents because we know that we can inherit so many things from our parents: the color of our hair, the color of our eyes, the shape of our nose. But the science of epigenetics tells us that we could actually inherit the same pain and trauma that our parents experienced. So, what we uncovered was that pain and terror that I felt every night wasn't actually my own. It was actually a cellular memory from my mother. And they've shown with Holocaust victims that the pain and terror that they experienced was passed down to their children and their grandchildren. So that pain and terror that I had in my body was a cellular memory from my mother. They say every female baby is born with 2 to 3 million of their reproductive eggs at birth. So for most of your mother's life, you experienced her triumphs as well as her traumas. And that's what it was for me. But Catherine, my story doesn't end there. There's actually a shocking past life connection to the very healer that I trusted in this lifetime to heal me. She was the very person that actually inflicted the pain on my family. And in that moment of revelation, I could have felt fear, anger, or betrayal, but I didn't. All I felt was the love and the perfection of the universe. And I saw how all of our souls are actually interconnected across lifetimes, how we can truly never get it wrong, how we're unconditionally loved, and how we could be healed in this moment or in any other moment or lifetime. And this is how I actually learned how to let go of stories. And this is what I'm sharing with listeners.
Oh, that's just a wonderful story. I have a couple of observations. Barbara Ann Brennan's book, Hands of Light, was one of the first books I ever read about energy healing. It's a
Mm.
wonderful book. And all of my Barbara Ann Brennan books are completely dog-eared from how many times I read them or referred them or showed some of the diagrams to my clients, because she has wonderful diagrams about what's happening in the human energy field. But the other thing that you pointed out, which is very interesting, in my work as a medical intuitive healer, I clear karma. And there's 4 layers that you can be holding karma. One of them is at the mind grid level, which is the stories you keep repeating with yourself. So if you keep telling the same story, you keep telling yourself the same story, you're going to experience the same thing, because your mind controls your emotions, which controls your energy system, which controls your physical. Then there's the DNA level. So as you mentioned, you realized or you learned that you were carrying your mother's cellular patterns. We 50% of our DNA comes from our father, 50% from our mother. And then when you go back to the grandparents, it's 25%, and then so on and so on. I also do a 7-generation healing to clear those ancestral patterns. But as you mentioned, some of the issues that we are facing, whether it's your emotional patterns or your thought patterns or even your challenges, such as addiction, may very well be carried through your DNA. And then there's a karmic contract. So this, you could have a soul contract with someone, and there's 3 kinds of soul contracts. So I may be here to help you, you may be here to help me, or we may be here to help each other. So it sounds very much like you had a soul contract with this particular healer, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And it was obviously mutual, right? So you were there to help each other, right? And then finally, you can be carrying karma all the way through the core soul level, which means that you've carried this karma through so many generations, so many lifetimes, excuse me, that this pattern is so deeply ingrained. It's deeply ingrained all the way to the level of your soul. And that is why, as you mentioned, sometimes we may be experiencing things and feeling things and having thoughts, but they have no correlation to what we ourselves have actually gone through in our lifetime.
Absolutely. Yes. And you talked about the soul contract that I had with my healer. At one of our very last sessions, it was interesting. Out of my mouth came something that I don't even know where it came from. And I can only say it came from my higher self. But basically, I said, I promise to find you.
Mm.
And her response is, Judi, you know who I am. So I believe it was our higher selves talking to each other.
Yes, and I fully believe um, often when my clients have interactions with people, on one level, they'll go, this isn't fair and so on. But when you look at things at a soul level, like you said, sometimes people come together for the specific reason of healing specific issues, right? And, people even talk about soulmates. Well, what does that really mean? A soulmate is someone who pushes you to grow.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
in that way, your healer was a soulmate for you, right?
Mhm.
And I suspect, even though she's not on the show, I suspect that she also grew as the result of the interaction with you.
Absolutely. And before you were talking about 7 generations, I believe we heal 7 generations back and 7 generations forward.
Yes, that is so true. So when you do the inner work, so you clear the root causes of your depression, your anxiety, your discomfort, your disease, you're clearing through the DNA for people who come after you, right?
Mhm. And
Now,
Catherine, you said something very important before, about the stories that we keep playing over and over again in this lifetime and in many others. And the subtitle to my book is A Path to Love, Forgiveness, and Transformation. And for me, forgiveness is really simple. It's to let go of the negative stories and contracted energies that no longer serve us. So painful and unwanted events are going to happen to all of us. We could either experience it once, or we could literally play it over and over again, like you said, until it becomes stuck, it becomes our identity. So for me, forgiveness is just really letting go of those stories that you talked about that no longer serve us.
yes. And so for our audience, let's talk about how they can tell whether or not they're trapped in a negative story. So one way that I would say is, if you're telling yourself any kind of story in which you are a victim, you're
Mhm.
a victim of the government, you're a victim of your mother, father, sister, brother, your job, right? That's one way, right? What are some of the other ways that you, as a coach, Judi Miller, help people understand that they're stuck in their stories?
I think first they need to understand between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And in that gap, there's a space. And in that space is our greatest superpower, our power to choose. And what I mean by that is we don't have to be on autopilot. Right? When something happens, we can observe what's happening. We can observe those thoughts. So we have over 60,000 thoughts a day. 95% of them are the same ones we had yesterday and the day before. And 80% of them are negative. As humans, we're actually hardwired to notice and observe and remember the negative aspects of a situation. And I believe it's because millions of years ago, it was critical for our survival. As cavemen and cave women, it was critical for our survival, but we no longer live in that reality, Catherine. So we need to first become aware of what our stories are, to observe them, right? And we could replace those negative patterns and those negative stories with love, with gratitude, with more empowering stories.
Yeah. And one exercise that I get a lot of my clients to do is, let's say you've been through a traumatic experience. So let's say, for example, you got a divorce or something bad happened to you as a child. Well, first thing you do is you simply write down your story. You get out your journal, you write down how you've been telling yourself in your head this thing happened, right? So you write your story down. And then once you've written your story down, then you go back and you reread it. Okay. And you reread it to yourself. And as you reread it, you make a note every place in the story where you have a negative emotion, whether it's anger, whether it's rage, whether it's grief, whether it's hopelessness or helplessness. You make a mental note where that story you've been telling yourself pulls up these negative emotions. Okay, so then what you do, once you do that, then you go back and you literally rewrite the story. Now, the rule is that you have to tell a story that's true. So let's say you were raped or your home was burglarized. You're going to still keep the facts of the story. But what you're going to do is you're going to rewrite the story from the point of view of your empowered soul, right? And you keep rewriting this story, over time, and this does take time to do it, until the story that you tell yourself brings up no negativity, right? So it's like, this happened as a result of this. I learned, I discovered my power about this or that. And you look, a good way to rewrite the story is look for ways where you found your strength, look for ways where you found your power. And you tell that story again and again. And again, it has to be 100% true. So you're not going to be lying to yourself, but you erase the negative charge by rewriting the story.
Mhm.
Judi Miller, as a coach and speaker, how do you get people to change their story?
Sure. So great. I'll love to answer that, but I just wanted to comment on something that you were saying. So, I believe that emotions are meant to be felt in the body, right? And you were talking about, rewriting our stories. So before I got on this interview, I felt a tightness in my chest, a fluttering in my stomach, a tightness in my throat, right? And some people might label that as nervousness, but those are the same exact sensations that I feel when I'm excited, right? So it's us who labels or determines what the story is, right?
Mhm.
So I just wanted to comment on that, based on what you were saying. So
Yes.
and you were asking me, how do I coach people to let go of their stories? First is to notice it, as I mentioned, to observe those thoughts. But the next part is to truly feel your emotions in your body. So when an event happens, it's so important for us to actually feel those sensations in our body without labels. So Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight. She was a Harvard neuroscientist who actually was able to heal herself from traumatic brain injury. But what I got out of her book was the 90-second rule. So when an event happens, Catherine, either good or bad, it literally takes us 90 seconds to actually experience those sensations in our body and then let them go. If it lasts longer than those 90 seconds, we've either started to create a story, either empowering story or disempowering story. So I invite people first to truly feel those sensations. Our culture and our society doesn't teach us how to feel our emotions. We often think about them. So I believe our body tells the truth. Our mind doesn't always create stories that are true, right?
Great observation. Absolutely. And, which brings us to another thing, because I think so many people, I believe in our culture in the United States, 12%, if I were correct, understand the statistic correctly, 12% of US adults are on some form of antidepressant medication, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of people who've labeled their feelings as bad, and and again, if you're listening, we're not judging you at all, but there's a lot of people who have discomfort or unease in feeling all their feelings. And one of the things I'm always telling my clients is that emotions are supposed to be energy in motion, emotion. And we get stuck. When we get stuck in our story or stuck in our feelings, that's when the problem happens. So and Judi Miller, as a coach, how can we empower people to have the strength
Mhm.
and the patience and the compassion, really, to feel all of their own feelings?
And I believe a lot of times the fear that people feel about feeling their emotions is just because it's something unfamiliar. So instead of calling it fear, just say it's something unfamiliar and take the 90 seconds truly to feel it, right? Because once you take the 90 seconds to feel those emotions, you can then let it go. As you mentioned before, what happens is that in our human energy field, when we hang on to those stories, those pains, those judgments, those labels, they get stuck in our human energy field and they distort our ability to actually see the world. So just very a simple analogy. When you wear pink glasses, pink sunglasses, everything looks pink. So
Yeah,
if your human energy field is distorted, it distorts how we see reality, right? So we need to learn to clean up that energy that's stuck in our human energy field. And part of it is truly feeling those sensations and then letting them go.
yeah, great advice. There's another little exercise that I get people to do, and this is actually from yoga. It's called a container exercise. So let's say you're listening to this broadcast and you go, I realize I'm recognizing that I have trouble with depression, or I recognize that I have trouble with anxiety or overwhelm or whatever the feeling is. Um, so what you do is it's called a container exercise. So what the first thing is to notice that the emotions are coming up for you. It's like, okay, I'm starting to feel these emotions. I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. The second thing that you do is you pick a container. Now, this is not like a garbage bag, it's not a real thing, it's an imaginary container. So, in your mind, you could visualize a big dumpster like they have here in Atlanta, in building sites where they throw away all the construction material, or it could be a little teacup. But you're going to choose a container, and it's as big as you think you can handle in that moment, or as small as you want to restrict it to. And then you allow yourself to feel those feelings to the point where you fill up the container. And you fill the dumpster, you fill the teacup. And then the third step is, once you have felt those feelings to fill the container, then you visualize yourself doing something. So you would visualize the Atlanta sanitation department coming and hauling off the container, or you visualize yourself burying the teacup or smashing the teacup. You move the energy, you get rid of it. And then the last step is you change the channel. So just like if you were watching a TV program and you decided, okay, I'm bored with this, you change the channel and you go do something different. So you change the energy once you have finished feeling that feeling. You get up and you go for a walk, you call a friend, you take a glass of water, you go exercise and move your physical energy. But in this way, by practicing the container exercise, you realize that you are strong enough to feel all of your feelings, including the uncomfortable ones, and that you have control over what you allow yourself to feel in any given moment.
That's a beautiful, beautiful way of doing that. Yeah. And Catherine, now when I have a contraction in my body, I say it's a blessing. I say thank you. And you know why I say that? I say that because I know it's an opportunity to heal and to release that energy that no longer serves me.
Now, Judi Miller, your book, Perfect, A Path to Love, Forgiveness, and Transformation, is broken up into three parts: story, reflections, and exercise. Why did you write your book this way?
So that's a great question. So they say most people actually don't read past the first 19 pages of a book. So the way Perfect is actually written is 80 to 90% of it is written like a novel. So you want to pick up the book, go through the experience and find out what actually happens at the end, because there is a shocking ending. And then the other two parts is there is a handful of pages which I call reflections. So what are the key lessons that the readers can actually get out of the book and apply in their own lives? And then there's also a handful of simple exercises, purposely simple because I know how crazy life is. So there's simple exercises so people could actually apply and embody what they learned from the story in their own lives and truly let go of the stories that don't serve them.
Can you give us an example of one of the exercises that you talk about in Perfect?
Sure. So this is a simple exercise, and I think it's so important right now. And I discovered it quite by accident. Many of us feel isolated right now. Many of us feel unloved. And I discovered that we can create that feeling of love in any moment, at any time. It's not dependent on anyone or anything. So, Catherine, if you're okay, you can do this with me. And if it's safe for listeners, they could do it as well. So I just close my eyes. And as I laid on my healer's table week after week, I would be there for literally 15 to 45 minutes with nothing to do as she worked on me. And I would close my eyes and I would bring in a picture of someone I loved. It could be my partner. It could be my child, my children. It could be my pet, my dog who thinks he's a cat and just makes me laugh. And I would not only just see it, but I would feel it in my body. What was I hearing, tasting, touching, sensing? And I would just let that feeling of love just permeate every cell in my body. And then I would bring in another image or memory, a beautiful sunset, the first time I saw a snowfall, the first time I held my children, the first kiss. And again, I would feel it in every cell. And then I would bring in another image. And I would bring in image after image after image as I laid there on the table. And one of my mentors told me that, I could also put my hand on my heart and tell myself that this is for me, that this is me. And this overwhelming sense of love just opened my heart. And I realized that I could do this in any moment, at any time, and so can anyone else, because this is the essence of who we truly are. So I invite people, when they feel lonely, when they feel unloved, they can do this for themselves. It's a great gift.
That's a wonderful, wonderful exercise, right? To call up that feeling, right? The visual,
Absolutely.
auditory, and kinesthetic feeling of love. Now,
Yeah. I was going to say, for me, I believe there's only two emotions in life: fear and love. Fear is just a contracted negative energy, wishing that we could change the past or afraid of the future. So when we let go of the fear, all that's left is love.
yes. Now, Judi Miller, um, your one of the words in your book title is forgiveness, and there's so many methods for clearing our past hurts. What does forgiveness mean to you?
So forgiveness, again, is not about condoning the actions of another person. It's really getting us out of the cycle of victimhood. It's helping us to let go of those stories that no longer serve us, so we don't have to replay that event over and over in our minds. So, the modality that you described earlier, your modality is a beautiful modality. The one that I use is to really acknowledge those sensations in our body. So if you think back to a negative sensation or a negative event in your life, where do you feel it in your body? Our bodies are amazing, intelligent. Our stories literally get attached to certain parts of our bodies. So Louise Hay from Hay House, she
Mhm.
wrote a book called You Can Heal Your Life, You Can Heal Your Body. And literally our stories get stuck in certain parts of our bodies. Like, and this is a gross simplification. If we have a pain in our elbow, it could mean that we have a story or a pain or a judgment about feeling unsafe. If we have a pain in our leg or our knee, maybe it's because we feel afraid to move forward. And again, this is a gross generalization, but our stories do get stuck in our bodies. So, first is to really notice and acknowledge where it is, right? And breathe into it. And then, oftentimes, what's the first image or memory that comes to mind related to that pain and that trauma? And sometimes it could be from this lifetime, it could be from when we were younger. And as you mentioned before, it could be even from a previous lifetime. But in that moment, an image or memory will come to you. And what are you saying to yourself during that stressful moment? So you're acknowledging it in your body. You're giving that younger version of yourself a voice, finally a voice that perhaps it never had. And then you can say a forgiveness prayer to release it and let it go. And again, I learned this from John Newton. So he's one of my mentors. I trained with him. So this is really something that I learned from him. But I found it to be very powerful in my life.
Okay. So, yeah, and I completely agree with you that we hold emotions in our physical body, we hold stories. When I'm doing a medical intuitive reading, part of what I look at is, what unresolved emotions or what thought patterns are literally causing your dis-ease. And in my book, The Difference Between Pain and Suffering, I go over how to get out of pain on all five levels: physical, energetic, emotional, mental, and spiritual. But there's always unresolved past issues on mental, emotional, or spiritual levels. So, again, we're talking about forgiveness. And one of the simple ways, in my view, to move the energy of forgiveness through you is to use mantras. And there's very, very simple mantras. I've written extensively about them. One of them is Ho'oponopono. Another simple one is simply, I love you. I
Mhm.
love you. And I love you. I love you. You love me. I forgive you. You forgive me. And I feel the most important person to forgive is actually yourself. If you can't forgive yourself, you're not going to be able to let go of the bitterness and resentment that you have towards other people. Uh,
Mm. I fully agree with you, and I love Ho'oponopono. I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. I think that's so beautiful and powerful.
yes. And
And
and the Bible talks about forgiveness, and how many times do I need to forgive someone? And it's like, again, I I liken forgiveness very much to vacuuming. I vacuumed last week and I may have to vacuum again this week. More than likely, answer is yes. And forgiveness, lack of forgiveness, absolutely blocks your energy, right?
yeah, absolutely.
It completely shuts down your creativity. If you have any sort of writer's block, I promise you, you have lack of forgiveness, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I love what you said before that oftentimes the person that we have to forgive is really ourselves. If it's okay, I'd love to share another story from my book. And
Absolutely, please.
and as I mentioned before, I was, on the table week after week creating this sense of love for myself. And what I found is that my heart just literally opened and I allowed miracles to happen. So I'm not a medium. And I always felt different most of my life, as I mentioned. And because I felt different, of course, I attracted a man into my life that was totally different from me. My husband is different racially, culturally, socially, spiritually, religiously. And I never felt like I fit in his family. So I always closed my heart so they would never be able to hurt me. And as I mentioned, I never felt like I fit in with them. And when my mother in law passed away, because I was grieving and because my heart was wide open, I actually was communicating with her. And she showed me every scene that I ever had with my husband and his family. And it was like a near death experience. I literally saw them go by in seconds.
Hmm.
And Catherine, what I realized was because I felt different, I made myself different. So that became my reality. My outer world and my outer experiences was just a reflection of what I was holding inside of me. So, what she taught me was the importance of forgiving ourselves and forgiving and letting go of those stories.
For sure. And, we know, many of us know that it's a good idea to forgive, but we're also not taught how. And again, using forgiveness mantras is a really simple way to begin to move the energy. And you mentioned about your heart being closed, and you noticed that your heart was closed. In my work, I can tell whether someone's heart is open or closed, and if your heart is closed, you're either punishing yourself or protecting yourself. So, Judi Miller, in your experience, what happens to a person when they close their heart? And how does someone know whether their heart is actually open?
That's a great question. So, I said that I started my career as a CPA. I didn't mention to you that my parents are accountants. My sister's an accountant. My husband's a CPA. My daughter is a CPA. So, I always grew up in an environment where we were always in our heads, right? We were never truly experiencing life in our bodies and through our emotions. We thought about everything. And then when I learned to feel those sensations of love and recreate it for myself, I truly felt my heart open and what it felt like. And when you look at children and they're so joyous and they're so happy, right? Everything is brand new to them. And what I learned is by living from an open heart, without the stories, the labels, and the judgments, I could experience each moment of life as if it was for the first time, where it's miraculous. And that's what it feels like to live with an open heart.
Oh, that's a great explanation of it. So you're really fully present, right? You're in
Mhm.
the now. Eckhart Tolle talks about in the now. Another thing that I observe when a person's heart is open is they're able to give and receive love, right? If your heart is closed, you're not letting anybody love you.
Mhm.
And you're not letting all the love that you have inside of you out either. And so you're able to give and receive love, and you're able to have compassion for others. Now,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Judi Miller, in your book, you also talk about a happiness set point. What exactly is our happiness set point? and how can we make it better so we can improve, have more happiness in our life?
Great question. So Marcy Shimoff wrote the foreword to my book, and she's the author of Happy for No Reason. So she made popular this term happiness set point, but basically it's our genetic and learned response to hovering around a certain level of happiness in our lives. So it's almost like when you get on a scale, not during COVID, but when you get on a scale, you normally hover around that 5 to 10 pound range. So that's what our happiness set point is. And they've actually shown that lottery winners, as well as paraplegics, a year after the event, they actually return to the same level of happiness, that happiness set point. But what science has shown is that 50% of our happiness set point is genetic. 10% is our external circumstances, for example, our job, our level of wealth, our marital status. And then 40% is actually the thoughts, beliefs, and stories we create for ourselves. And then earlier, I mentioned to you the science of epigenetics. The science of epigenetics and Dr. Bruce Lipton says the 50% that's genetic could also be influenced by our thoughts and our feelings and our judgments. So we actually have significant control over the level of happiness that we have in our lives. So as I mentioned before, we have 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are quite negative, but we need to become aware of our thoughts and replace it with more positive thoughts, thoughts of gratitude, thoughts of love, because we know from the law of attraction, what we put out comes back to us.
For sure. Absolutely. Now, in your opinion, Judi Miller, what is our greatest superpower?
So our greatest superpower is really our power to choose. And before I was mentioning that between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And it's in that gap we get to decide. We get to decide how we experience life. So those painful and unwanted events are going to happen, but we get to decide whether or not we hang on to them. We get to decide whether or not we come from a place of fear, and we get to decide whether or not we come from a place of love.
Great answer. Now, you talk about John Newton and you credit the work of John Newton in your healing journey. Who exactly is John Newton?
So John Newton does ancestral healing, and he's the founder of Health Beyond Belief. So he was really my mentor that taught me first we need to experience it in our bodies. We need to give that younger version, that younger child, a voice. And then using powerful either mantras, forgiveness prayers to really release and let go of that energy. Catherine, there's a story that I have in my book that I'd love to share with you because I think it's so relevant for now.
Please.
So, as I was laying on the healing table, my healer offered to do a hypnosis, really to see whether or not there was anything in my past, especially my childhood, that might have triggered these fears. And as I was on the table, I knew exactly what was going on, but my mouth had a mind of its own. I don't know if you've ever been through hypnosis, but it had a mind of its own. But it was interesting. So first I was ascending through these different colors. I ascended through this purple haze and then out into this bright white light. And it felt again like a near death experience. I was dying literally with my eyes wide open. And as I merged with this overwhelming love and bright white light, I merged into this sense of love. And the message that I got was we can all come home. We can all come home by loving and accepting who we are exactly as we are, that the joy is in the reunion, in the remembrance of who we are. And the reason I wanted to share that with you and your listeners is because I find it ironic that right now we're all being sent home. And before I mentioned that I believe that the isolation and the loneliness that we feel is not the isolation from each other. I believe it's the isolation because we've become disconnected from our creator, from the God of our understanding, whatever that might be. And we've also become disconnected from the essence of who we truly are. So we're all being sent home because so many of us have abandoned ourselves emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And this is our opportunity to reconnect with ourselves.
That's a very, very powerful message. So here we are, we're, in differing degrees depending on where you are on the planet of social isolation. How do you recommend that we go about reconnecting with ourselves?
Mhm. Anytime we spend time reconnecting with ourselves is powerful. And self-love and self-care is not arrogant. The more deeply we love ourselves, the more love we have for others. So as I mentioned, I believe that we've abandoned ourselves emotionally. So instead of feeling those fear and those anger, Replace it again with gratitude, love, spend time truly feeling those emotions. And I think it's important, not to digress, but when you're feeling fear, you're contracted, right? And when you're contracted and when your fist is closed, you can't let anything else in. So what I mean by that is when you're feeling fear and contraction, you can't let love in. There's no room for it. So we have to let that go if we want truly to have love and abundance in our lives. So make sure you find time to really nourish yourself emotionally. Physically, many of us know the things that we have to do. We need to get proper sleep. We need to get water. We need to eat healthy. We need to exercise. You talked about movement, Catherine, before. We are energy. So we need to move, right? And then the last one is spiritually. So it doesn't have to be religious. If you're religious, beautiful. It could be praying, but it could also be being in nature. It could be stillness. It could be silence. It could be meditation. Um, so I believe we need to do those things to really nourish ourselves.
Great message. And we have the time to do that right now, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have time to nourish ourselves. So, John Newton, can you tell us a little bit more about the work, his work, and how that particular modality works?
Right. So, again, about acknowledging and then giving the voice, but his prayer, and sometimes he calls it a recipe, right? So it's actually, he allowed me to reprint it in my book, and it's actually on his website for free. So he calls it a recipe if you're not religious, but basically it calls in, and if it's okay with you, again, it's not religious. If I could just say the first part of it, infinite creator, all that you are for me, all my family, all our relationships, all our ancestors, and all their relationships through all relevant space, time, and dimension. Please help us all forgive each other, forgive ourselves, forgive all people, and all people forgive us completely and totally. Please and thank you. And like John's prayer and very powerful mantras and the Ho'oponopono, it's so powerful because it includes so many different components. It includes gratitude, it includes humility, it includes calling in the creator if you believe in the creator. So it calls in all of those amazing forces to help us release and soften those burdens that we carry.
Very, very powerful and beautiful prayer. So, in these periods of isolation where it's so easy for people to feel alone or unloved or cut off, are there any particular practices that you can recommend that we can do in order to feel more love and to feel that connection to all the love that is available for us?
Right. So one of them is definitely spending time creating that sense of love. So I actually describe other ones in my book, but I also have a free ebook on my website. But some of them I'll just explain really easy. Catherine, you said we're energy, right? So we need to move because we're energy. So when I find that I'm stuck and stagnated in my life, it was because I was not moving. So we truly need to move. The second exercise is very simple also. And again, I made them purposely simple, but we need to create because we are the creator. We are made from the creative life force of the universe. And when we don't create, that also becomes stuck and stagnated in our bodies, and it may cause pain and even illness. So it could be anything. It could be dancing, it could be singing, it could be painting. I play the classical guitar. But what I discovered, Catherine, it doesn't even have to be that complicated. We can create in the simple acts of life. We could be creative when we prepare our meals for our family, how we dress, how we decorate our homes. Because we are a creative life force, we need to find opportunities to create. And then the last one, just very quickly, because I know that we are limited on time, but sing and let our spirit find its voice. So for most of my life, I had problems expressing myself and finding my voice in the world. And I believe it's because it was that cellular memory from my mother when she was told that she wasn't allowed to talk about this experience.
Mm,
So my healer recommended that I sing.
mm.
So by singing, it opened up my throat chakra, but it also different songs open up your other chakras as well. So Catherine, this is kind of funny, but here I am in finance and I have to give lots of presentations. So I would literally tiptoe out, sneak out into the parking lot, into my car, turn on the radio and sing. And then I would go back into my office and do my presentations. And I found that by singing, again, it opened up my chakras, but also the forward momentum and that energy that you talked about just made me able to continue to talk and to present. So again, those are just very simple exercises that I include.
Yes. And I believe that our souls long to create. And so
Mm,
many people, it's like, oh, am I going to make a living or make money writing this book or singing this song or painting this painting? Well, as you mentioned, your soul longs to create. And it's a
mhm.
very important, creativity is very powerful soul medicine, I believe. So, Judi Miller, any final thoughts for our audience?
So I really do believe it's about letting go of our stories. I believe that when we change our perspective, our life changes, everything changes because we can no longer go back and see the same things the same way. So for me, what if life was one huge interconnected puzzle with no wrong pieces, each piece perfect and part of the whole? And when we see life that way, we can let go of the stories of no longer feeling loved or unworthy. We can truly see and experience the miracle that we are.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter and you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. And our guest today has been Judi Miller, author of Perfect, A Path to Love, Forgiveness, and Transformation. You can find out more about Judi Miller and her work at judimiller.net. And remember, when you activate the energy of forgiveness, you heal yourself on all levels. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.